Hello, everybody. My name is Ian Kirkpatrick Cake. I'm an author, idiot, and loin streamer, and today we're going to be doing something pretty low key. Last week we had some spicy topics. I almost had a literally spicy topic today, but I wanted to do something much more laid back, much more just chill, and that is what makes you want to talk about a book? What makes, or a story in general, what makes a story memorable to you? Not only memorable, but like you want to share it. And so I'm going to list a couple of, I've read so many books on this channel, like hours of critique, hours of talking about the same stories. And I can tell you for sure that since I've started doing book reviews, I remember a lot of content better, but it also still starts to fade because I kind of use the reviews as a sort of mental flush of whatever I went through with those, unless they were great books. Otherwise, it's like this is getting it out of my head, and then I can move on to something else. But some things just don't. And memorable does not indicate whether something was enjoyed or not enjoyed. Memorable is just it sticks with you. You don't have to particularly like it. So I'm going to go through a list of characters that stand out to me, that I remember very well, and that come up in conversation, or that I can look at the book and be like, yes. And I can tell you why, or why I use stuff as examples. And I'm going to bring up some other examples of things that, like, characters that don't matter. And then I'm going to bring up some stuff about the story stands out more than the characters. But usually what gets me excited to talk about anything is the characters. I am a character person, character addict. I love the characters. You'll hear me talk about my characters all the time. I'll talk about these gentlemen here in a second. The book coming at the end of the month. I'm so excited for them. I love them. But that's the thing. What gets you excited and what makes you want to share? I'm going to share stuff that you may or may not have heard before on the channel, since I'm going to go over books that I have read in the past. But you know what? The more love that I can give to any characters that I love, and also just in general, just sharing characters that I have run into, that I have read, is a way to give them life. And so I don't necessarily mind talking about characters or books that I didn't really like, because maybe they'll interest you to go and check out their stories. Either way, I think it's a learning experience. But I want to know, before we get into this topic, while I do, the intro stuff that you're probably going to skip over anyway if you've seen videos from me before, I want you to think about what makes a book or a story. It could be a movie, it can be a television show, it can be a video game, any sort of long form storytelling. What makes it stand out to you? What makes it memorable to you? Before we get started, number one, if you enjoy what I do here on the channel, please remember to like, share, and subscribe for more. Number two, if you would like to be featured on the channel, check out the links down in the description below. The number one way to be featured is through Lemoy, the monthly prompt writing contest, where I give you a prompt, you write a short story using that prompt, and on the first Monday video of the month, we bask in your creativity. The second way to be featured is if you are an indie author and you have a book out or a book that is coming out, if you submit it to the Fresh Meat feature. That is, if you submit your first chapter to the Fresh Meat feature, it'll be read here on the channel to hopefully help more readers find your work. It's the best way that I can think of to share a wide variety of books that may not be my taste, but it may be yours. There is an audience. If it is out there, you could probably find an audience somewhere. Just prepare yourselves. If you put it out there, prepare yourselves. The third thing is, if you would like to check out any of my books, they're available at any of your favorite places. 2 Good Books, including the local library, upon request. My newest novel, Body More Zero, is coming out in October, featuring these 2 gentlemen over here, Ralph and Casey, brothers, bandmates. Can you guess which one plays the guitar and which one plays the drums? Ralph actually plays a lot more than the drums, but I digress. I couldn't be more proud of their story and how it's turned out, and I'm excited to get to share it, and I hope that anybody that checks it out will also enjoy it for what it is. With that said, let's get into the topic. So looking at books that I've rated, number one, I'm going through my Goodreads list because I've got the couple on my head that generally come up when I start talking about books or stories. And like, this is coming off of doing the review of Polaris Rising, where I know that character is just going to fade into the background. All those characters are just going to fade from my mind very quickly here. I even know sometimes when I'm reading and I'm taking notes, the names are just not sticking when I write, and I have to pause and go, what the frick was their name again? Ada was one of those characters because she didn't really matter. She didn't really have her own identity. And that's what I want to stick with. And that's what I want to put down. as one of the things that makes characters memorable for me. Not in a they are great or they are terrible sort of way, but in a way that they stick in my head is they are specific in who they are. And so one of the first characters that I want to bring up today is Eva from We Need to Talk About Kevin, because her speech patterns, the way that she talks, the way that she goes into stories to set things up is so specific to her that she'll be a memorable character, even just because of the way that I responded to her, which was I did not like her generally for the most of the book, but she was still interesting. And a character does not have to be likable in order to be somebody memorable or in order to tell a compelling story. And we hear so much so often about how a character needs to be likable or else your story is a failure. Sometimes people are just not likable. Sometimes, and that doesn't mean that they don't have anything interesting to say or an interesting perspective. And often I think that gets lost in this idea that we need to feel compassion for the main character. And maybe you'll never feel compassion for the main character when you get to the end of their story. Or maybe you'll feel compassion a little bit when you get to the end of the story and you see how they've changed. I've got my own characters that are a little bit on the difficult side. I'm looking at you, Joey. I actually think that people will find Casey easier to like than Joey, even though Casey is his own hot mess. He is more dangerous than Joey, okay? Not lying. Anyway, a character does not have to be likable to be memorable. You don't even have to like the book in order for the character to be memorable. And what makes Eva memorable is her distinct manner of speaking. If you open the book and you start reading the letters and you see how she speaks, then you'll start to get a sense of why she is memorable. She talks like somebody who came from money or who had a lot of money in the background, who came from a posh upper class society or social standing and had dropped down. And the way that she dissociates in the conversations as she's talking to Franklin about what's happened to them is so specific. Oh, and the way that she sets things up that is always Kevin's fault. I hated her so much. I think that also leaves an impact on whether you remember somebody or not, because your emotions sort of imprint on you, and everybody is going to then have somebody like different everybody is then going to have different reasons why they remember characters or different characters that stick with them, because they will either emotionally bond with that character in a strong way or emotionally despise that character in a strong way that it sticks. Speaking of despising characters, go with me on this. Dalen from Shadow of the Conqueror is actually a very memorable character for me, because of how strongly in his own rejection of his guilt he is, because of how insufferable he is, and how up his own buttocks he is with his confidence, his never doing anything wrong, that it is imprinted on me, his denial of his crimes. Also, I think the Kool-Aid Man pretty much ruined it. I'm never going to get away from thinking of him as the Kool-Aid Man coming through the wall, ripping the dick off, throwing it out the window, and then telling the little girl not to be sad because he just killed her dad. There are certain things that are just wild. But at the same time, not all wild things, remember, like, at some point, there's so much wild that you just stop registering it. So it's got to be like a surprising wild. Another memorable character for me is Swanee. I don't even remember what her last name is, though, so don't come at me on that. But Swanee from His Name is Augustine, and she had another very posh, upper-class style way of talking, where she drew out the mundane when she was describing it. And puckering of the anus is one of the things that I will associate her with. But I think part of it is also the craziness of that series, that it makes it hard to forget. Between every book, you'd think it's like 400 or more pages for every single book, and there were 6 books in that series, and you would think at some point the craziness of the books could run out. But then there would be, and that's probably what made it stand out, is there was so much mundane throughout the entirety of the book, mixed with the dialect or the way that the narrative voice was speaking. And then all of a sudden you'd get this really bizarre thing, but it's also treated so plainly, which I think is something that more people could take advantage of, even when the story is about something ridiculous. The way that you write the characters is how it's going to be perceived as normal or abnormal. So if you look at, like, his name was Augustin, when they were talking about the blood rituals or doing anal to get your blood purity higher so that you can have magic, everybody was just like talking about it chilly, which makes it look like it is very common. Meanwhile, you look over at Polaris Rising, where they're constantly just talking about, well, it's really easy to kill people. Same, Zenith did the same thing, where it wants you to think that killing people is hard and badass, and like Locke is in trouble because he killed a bunch of people when he was fleeing from the army. But at the same time, they're all just chill about it. When what's her face, Ada, is trying to get out of a situation and she's shooting a bunch of people, and she goes, "Oh, I'll feel bad about killing them later." Spoiler alert, she never feels bad about them. When you treat it with such dismissal, you take away the power or the authority or the oddness around what you are doing. And so if you want your character to look badass and then you just have them kill everybody around them, they don't look badass. They just look psychopathic, because we're looking at it from the perspective that life has value in general. I mean, most people look at it that way, I would assume. Maybe you don't assume that life has value, and so then it really doesn't mean anything when somebody kills somebody. There's that. But if in the book it's supposed to have weight, then you have to show by character reactions that something has weight. And so when it doesn't, like in Polaris Rising, and she just kills people and it's nothing, then that's going to set the standard. In the same way that when Swanee is talking about analing to have higher blood purity, if she's talking about it chill and everybody around her is just like, well, yeah, of course, then that's going to set the standard that this is normal. It's the reactions from other people that make it look abnormal, or that make something look abnormal. And that's one of the roles that, like, Kelly plays in Dead End Drive, one of my books, is everybody is there for the murder. Everybody knows that the murder is going to happen, except for, Madame Astra. But Kelly doesn't know, because he's been closing his ears every time that Gavin's tried to tell him, because he doesn't want to go through with any of this. He's a kid. He's a bit of an immature person in general. But, I mean, you're still telling this 14-year-old to pay attention to becoming master of the house where everybody is going to try to kill you. But it's his reaction that shows you what is going on is not normal. In the same way with Jan, you have the difference between Jan and then the difference between Blake and Boom. And it is their reactions to the situation that show you what is or is not normal. Or rather, Blake is supposed to show you that she recognizes what's happening to Jan is not normal, while Jan does not recognize what is happening to him is kind of sketchy. So the external reactions and the internal reactions set for the reader how they should be reading a situation, because that sets the standard, that sets the culture of the story. So if you have Polaris Rising, and so then it's treating this abnormal stuff very normal, the culture, that I think then sticks with you. Another memorable character or characters for me would be, like, a lot of them in Yakuza. Not all of them are memorable. Kuze is very memorable, but I always think of the Yakuza 0 scenes where it's specifically the sewer, because the cinematography around Kuze is beautiful. I always think about it. Maybe it's also because I've made some music videos with Zero, so I spent a lot of time with Zero. But Kiryu, very specifically, is a very memorable character because of, like, the sincerity. He is so straightforward, and he is kind of a pea brain. He's smart in other ways, but he's kind of a pea brain, and he's very direct. And it is the sincerity, I think, that makes him memorable. Arthur Morgan from Red Dead Redemption 2 is another memorable character for me, not just because of his voice, oh my gosh, and because of Dutch Vanderland. You can't have Arthur without Dutch. I don't think that you can have Red Dead Redemption without Dutch, because he's in the first one. We're going to be playing the first one soon. It comes out at the end of the month. We're on it, guys. But it is the strength and the sincerity in those characters that makes them more memorable, because if they were just blank slates, they wouldn't be. It's also... Arthur is aggressive, okay? And he has every right to be aggressive. He was grown up in an aggressive area where you got to be to survive. And, I mean, Micah is also memorable specifically because of how much he makes you hate him. Who doesn't think Black Lung and the go? Saint Gregory's main character, Ambrose, was memorable for me. I bonded with that character. I liked that character because he was hardworking, he was curious, he was caring, and he went through this situation of like he was a man of the cloth. He was a holy man who went to go look for his brother in the church, and he felt like he was unholy or unfit for the position because he had to break some of the rules that the church had set for the leadership. But if he didn't, then he wasn't going to be able to investigate what he needed to investigate. He also ran into a situation where he fell in love with a woman when he wasn't supposed to, and he decided that he needed to step away. But it was the nobility, the bravery, the character having that in common with me in a way where you just never feel like you're good enough, and you have to break the rules. You don't not believe in something, but you have to break the rules in order to make something happen, because life isn't perfect. And so then you just feel like you are an imperfect person who will never be good enough, even though you try to do your hardest, but you don't know what to do with yourself. And I thought Ambrose was a very compelling character, and a character that I wanted to root for. It was actually Ambrose's character. I actually thought that Teen Death's character was going to be similar to Ambrose's character, and that did not happen. I also think that Mary from Mary Sue, the comic, is a very memorable character, and that has to do with her being so highly emotional, so highly expressive. So she throws everything in. She's a character kind of like Curie, where she is sincere in everything that she does and in who she is and in the way that she approaches. And she might not be trying to be mean, like when she's talking about, well, all of this stuff might be gone in 5 million years, but I'm not going to be around to see it. So, that's a good thing, little girl. And she doesn't realize how what she's saying is going to affect other people. She's so sincere in interacting with everybody. And then when they sincerely, or when they give her attention back, she's not sure how to respond, because I think that she's also not really used to receiving that sort of attention, which is like when Songbird gave her attention, or when she was genuinely connecting with the Merman Prince. And it is that sincerity and her character responding to the surroundings that make her so memorable. Another memorable character for me is Michael from Lawn Boy, and that is because he is so insufferable. I think what is the funniest there is that he spends the entire book avoiding getting a job because he just hates being bossed around. Then a bunch of jobs fall in his lap as he's kind of just lounging around. Somebody related to him is like, hey, we're going to start a lawn business near the end. Like, he doesn't even try to get a job. He eventually thinks about applying for a job at Walmart, but then is like, you know what? This guy that I'm interested in actually hates Walmart, so screw Walmart. I wouldn't get a job there anyway. And then he hates capitalism the entire time, but his entire goal is to go to Disneyland, and he ends up going to Disneyland. Insufferable, but that's why you remember him. Frank from Supermarket, which we read on the Loin Stream, is mostly memorable for his potassium facts and his racism. Bonnie and Jesse from Guns and Smoke are less memorable for... So the funny thing here is I initially read this because somebody I was friends with was reading it, and I wanted to have something in common. But then I realized that I did not like the book. But I couldn't talk about it because I didn't want to mess up the relationships with that person because they knew the writer. Well, then I agreed to read it with somebody else. I agreed to read it with Monty because Monty is a Western person, and I forgot how thirsty the book was. At this point, my brain has washed how thirsty the prose are, but I remember that the prose were thirsty. Sebastian and Will Ellis are memorable because of the second book, which Sebastian wasn't in the first book. Will Ellis spends the entire time leading Sebastian on, but telling him we can't get in a relationship because I can't do relationships. And then Sebastian finally gets a yes from Will Ellis, and immediately Will Ellis is eyeballing this houseworker named Savannah instead, and wanting to sleep with Savannah, even though he just got with Sebastian, and he won't break up with Sebastian because he's like, I was going to give Sebastian an actual try because Sebastian's been pursuing me for a long time. And then Sebastian turns out to be a bad guy and dies, and Will Ellis feels really bad about it and is crying on his grave and gonna like kill himself when Savannah shows up, and then they have sex on Sebastian's grave. And that's the only thing that makes that memorable. Like 600 pages. That and The Cage Fighter with Jesse being called Montana are like the only... That book took 2 kill shots at Monty. Those are the only thing. And Jesse's jeans sticking to his body in leather and lace. Oh yeah, and Bonnie crying when orange juice got spilled on her dress. That's all I remember from that book. But Sebastian's grave being desecrated is the reason that book is memorable. The cast of Eve the Awakening, like, I know that Eve the Awakening has a bad reputation because of who the author is, and people just like to make fun of it, but it has a memorable cast. Now, it also does the trope that I don't like, which is in a lot of thirsty books, and that is getting into a fight with like the bully or the love interest. In this case, it's a bully who then sort of soft key sexually harasses somebody while they're pinned to the ground. But the cast of Eve the Awakening is memorable, at least for me. One, because of Sanchez, who is his inventor self and his accidentally inhaling the ashes of the dead and then going, oh my gosh, and freaking out that he is eating dead people. You've got Percy, who had the thing where every time they were at his house, they were accidentally destroying a piece of his property, and the diamond bullets. Hacker chick, I don't even remember what her name was. I just remember that she had the like stripes in her hair, and she hacked into the system at work or at school to show off some bully's porn collection as a presentation. But I couldn't heavily talk about all of the characters because I don't fully remember all of them. But if you see, it's like the little tiny things that make the characters interesting, that make them memorable. Empress Teresa, I talk about all the time in my real life because I tell people about how she went to the meeting in the Middle East to tell the Middle Eastern leaders that the Middle East sucked and looked gross, and then showed them pictures of the meadows in in Europe, and we're like, hey, do you want the Middle East to look like this, or do you want it to be a disgusting desert? I also remember her going to the Middle Eastern leadership and being like, hey, you need to behave and stop being terrorists, or else I'm going to open up my oil island and I'm going to charge 1 penny less. And I'm going to destroy your economy. And then also her making Jew Island, which she wanted to make in the shape of a Star of David. And the president of Israel was like, no. And then there was when she grounded a bunch of lawyers in New York City, from New York City, because she had actually mined planets in space for gold, and it lowered the price of gold, but she was able to spread wealth throughout the world. And these lawyers in New York wanted to sue her for destroying their business of investment by bringing more gold until they gave up. Because they couldn't get into their offices, because whenever they got into electrical devices, the electrical devices would die, so they couldn't get into their offices. And there's so much memorable about Empress Teresa, okay? And it always upped the ante. Jean-Baptiste from the book Perfume, a diary, was it a diary? A story of a murderer, is memorable or left an impact on me specifically because of the strength of his smelling. And it's actually his smelling ability that he used to make perfume that made him so obsessed with human smells that went partially into the inspiration of Jan and Jan's ability to like lick rocks and then know the composition of the rocks and to put chemicals together that way. His character is just so distinct. Oh, and the ending. So in case you don't know, Jean-Baptiste is a character who is so obsessed with creating the perfect smells of perfume. Like, he can smell a perfume and know exactly the compositions of what is inside of that perfume and be able to duplicate it. And for a little while, he worked as an apprentice underneath a perfumer, and he would use this ability to do that. Well, then he gets obsessed with creating the perfect perfume that creates obsession, and he uses virgins to do that. And, he does eventually create the perfect perfume, which, spoiler alert, in case you haven't read it so far, you should read it. It's a great book, but he does make the perfect perfume that creates obsession around whoever is wearing it. And I think that's all that I'm going to tell you about that book. It is worth reading. It is a short read, and the ending will get you. Or you can go watch the video review on this channel that I did for it. It's pretty short, comparatively. But it's because of who these characters are. Maybe. Some of these I could not recommend because of the characters. Like Guns and Smoke, I couldn't recommend because of the characters. It's a slog of thirst trapping. Lawn Boy, if you want to suffer. If you want to suffer insufferability, but like with no payoff. Eva is insufferable, but not like Michael. Now, there are a bunch of books in the last couple of years that actually the characters don't seem to matter at all. Ensemble pieces will always be harder because you're dealing with large casts of people, and now you're trying to get readers to identify or understand or click with these large casts of characters, and you also have to find some way to make them stand out, and it can be very, very difficult. I think one of the worst offenders of this is Amygdala, because I think in trying to make the characters stand out, rather than doing character differences that actually matter, it relies more on visual differences. But the characters in this don't really matter because the story is actually about political arguments. And so then your characters are constantly going to be falling in one of two camps, specifically in that book. And those are the Lockett camps or the Methuselah camps, where the Methuselah camps lose in the end. But every character falls into the complete anarchy or the other side where it was like control and caring about society or commune. I mean, Ludwig wanted to be part of a commune. Methuselah was doing medicine. But the characters don't really matter. They're just vehicles for the political argumentation that you will eventually see in the story. Pretty Dead Queens also was a book where I can't even remember the name of the main character of that book, but all of the characters from Alexis Dunn books, the main characters, as far as I'm aware, they all seem to be basically the same. And then you get an ensemble cast around them that doesn't really matter, give or take. Crimson Rin was one of the comics that I read on this channel, and it was one comic, so it could develop further than it did, but none of the characters really stood out to me to be like, which I think Crimson Rin was about as long as the Five Mary Sue comics that I have, so you had enough time to establish a character that mattered, but it didn't click to me. Necrotown is another one that none of the characters really mattered. They kind of just had a walk-on role as necessary. Like the lawyer never came back, the one that he called to ask for the favor for the werewolf kid. The werewolves never really came back. The gargoyles never meant anything. He showed up to see the daughter who had now taken over Necrotown, and it didn't really matter. That's another interesting thing, is the difference in there's so many of the NPCs in books where you just murder a bunch of people and they don't matter. Oh my gosh, Lightlark did that too. Speaking of wanting to act like something doesn't matter, when Isla freaking killed all of those nobles that belonged to Cleo, and it was like there wasn't any weight behind that because there was no response, but you would think that it would destabilize something because you just killed a bunch of noble people. The Long Moonlight spent no time really establishing the characters to make them matter, and it was the first time that I was really like, you know what? If that's what fridging a character is like, then I get it, because of how Salus was used and just kind of brought in immediate romance, then died. Iron Flame / Fourth Wing is one of the worst offenders for this ensemble cast, where it just introduces 1.5 million characters and none of them matter. And it's usually just used for fodder because you know that the only people that matter are going to make it to the end, which are Dane, Zayden, and Violet. Adolf in Wonderland didn't really bother to try to establish anything. I don't know if that is the general thing that happens with Bizarros, but I can't think of anything to talk about with Adolf in Wonderland. It's just, it's nothing. And you would think that there would be something to talk about with when you got a pin-up hot chick with tentacles coming out of her dress on the front of cover and you got the swastika and everything, but there's nothing. Inugami Curse felt like a pretty typical genre fiction story of a mystery, specifically Japanese mystery, where the roles were filled. And actually, it's interesting having read the Inugami Curse and then playing Judgment, because I can see I can see similar things in the way that they are built and how that formula goes for telling that kind of story. Avalon Timefall is another one where the characters really didn't matter, and that one also had a character named Aiden, whom I remember more than the main character. Julie, that was her name. Well, I just remember Julie because she used a dream to say that she could cheat on her husband when her husband didn't even need to exist because he didn't play a role in the story, period, anyway. Cuckoo and Manhunt are all by Gretchen Felker Martin are also stories that have ensemble casts where everybody in the cast is basically the same. But again, it tries to use the physical differences as the only thing that says, hey, look, they're all different, but they all have the same personality. They all believe in the same thing. And the story is them all just getting along and everything else is against them. So they all sound the same. Something else that makes characters all sound the same, BT dubs, is when they all talk with the same slurs all the time or the same swearing. Like if you make everybody immaturely say fuck all the time, they're gonna sound the same. Tricks is another one that has an ensemble cast where it is just an overload of tragedy. Everybody has a tragic background with not much time spent on it. It is just like hitting you over the head with kid abused, kid abused, kid abused, run away, kid abused, run away, kid abused, possibly for the point of just hurting the audience as opposed to it actually being genuine with the characters, not telling a character story. It's a PSA. Zenith also is a large cast, an ensemble cast. I don't remember any of the characters' names except for Andy. I remember there was a little tiny girl and there was a big chick and there was the male love interest and there was the lizard chick with the hot skin plates. But again, it was like diversity of appearance more so than character appearance diversity. Oh yeah, and then there was the guy that was in jail that they had to go and rescue, that he was a painter. And then the last one with an ensemble is Akatar. And the only thing that makes Feyre memorable is that she has appeared 1.5 million times in 1.5 million knockoff stories since Akatar became popular. Now, Akatar was not the first book to make a story that revolves around a character like Feyre exist, but it is the current phenotype for a certain type of content that is taking over. And it was the phenotype for Fourth Wing and the phenotype for Polaris Rising. And so you just see that character everywhere, but with different names to different levels of extremity. I was just going to say, what did I read recently that had a painter? Freaking The Butt Cracker, which was a knockoff of Akatar. So, of course, you had Feyre, who was a painter, and then the main character, I don't even remember her name. I remember Louisa. I do not remember the other character, though. I've just kind of gone over some of the stories that I remember because of the characters, or the characters that I can't even name because I barely remember them, period. And the point of this is to talk about stories that make me want to talk about them because of the characters in the story. I love sharing specifically characters in stories. That's what gets me excited, and that's what I love to talk about with my stories. But those aren't the only things that can make a story memorable. There are also plenty of stories where you might remember the theme or the story over the characters. My Dark Vanessa has strong characters within the context of the story. Mr. Strain and Vanessa are very strong. Their placement is very strong. Vanessa's descriptions of her memories, of her surroundings, of her interactions with others, very strong. But what is remembered more with me with My Dark Vanessa than her character is the story. And I can't say that I like to talk about the character because I don't really feel excited about the character, but I am excited about the story of My Dark Vanessa. The same with The Origin of the Sky. The Origin of the Sky is an ensemble cast in a way because it has the mountain and the lake and then the baby that they adopted, but then interspersed between the traveling of the mountain and the lake as they become a person is you've also got these mythologies or these stories that built up the origin of the world that they're being told as they go through. And so I don't necessarily remember every single character or every single story of that book, but I do remember the theme, the ending, what the story is about, the building of who we are. It's not just the origin of the sky, it's the origin of us. It's the origin of how people are who we are. And so I remember that. The Bluest Eye is also a story that I think The Bluest Eye has a strong characterization throughout. It's also actually an ensemble cast. But what you remember more is that the biggest character is the neighborhood, because it spends so much time jumping from different perspectives to show you how these different characters in this neighborhood think of each other and interact with each other through these individual stories. And that's more what you remember, the spite, the how the community specifically uses Pincola, was that her name? To feel better about themselves, because at least they are not the 8-year-old who was raped by her father and is now pregnant with her father's child. At least they are not her. And so you spend so much time, rather, looking at this neighborhood through the perspective of all of these characters instead of getting close to a character. There's also really like no way to get excited for any of these characters. It's a tragedy. And when it comes to my memorable characters, I think that Casey and Ralph are going to be some of my most memorable characters of my cast that's available now. It'll be interesting to see how that'll change when I do stuff in the future. I don't think that Predisposed to Bliss is going to have the same effect, because I don't think it's going to be a story that people are necessarily excited for or can be excited for or can root for the characters for. I have a couple stories like that. I do think that you can actually really like Ralph, and I think Ralph is really lovable, but that is, that's me. I also think that Casey, he's rough around the edges, but I think there's a lot to like about him when you get past his criminality. But it'll be interesting to see how they compare, especially when brought into Numinous Star, and you get to see more of their interactions on a different scale when they are no longer just alienated with the two of them. It'll also be interesting to see the comparisons with how people feel for the Westies and who people choose to like the most out of the Westies. If anybody likes anybody in the Westies, maybe everybody will hate everyone in the Westies, and I can be the sole Westies lover. But I do think, funny enough, I think Casey is easier to like than Joey, even though Casey is easily more of a criminal. Because Joey doesn't actually hurt anybody. Casey does. That's not a spoiler. Book chapter 1 opens with talking about how he fights people before concerts. So it's rough. Joey doesn't actually hurt anybody, but she does have a chip on her shoulder, and her loyalty, I think, can be harder for people to see because of the chip on her shoulder and because she is so self-involved. You're in her head, and she is self-centered, which is actually part of it. She is self-centered around certain things. Like, she continually sees things through her perspective only and doesn't realize there are other perspectives happening, which is actually part of book 3, where she kind of gets caught up. Casey smacks her over the head, figuratively, not literally, with "it's not all about you." But I do think, funny enough, they're both loyal, though. I think it's an interesting comparison between the two. Meanwhile, I think Jan is a memorable character because he is so specifically quirky in his eating of chemicals and his positivity that I have not yet met anybody who has read Jan's book and has not liked him because of how he is. And then when you get to Dead End Drive and you have that ensemble cast, I think the most memorable characters in Dead End Drive, which has like 12 characters as the main startup, it was hard to do because I needed to quickly introduce all of the characters with their setup types because of how the story starts with knocking them off, since it's a rat race. But so you got to know the 12 characters before they start getting knocked off. May have done things slightly differently if I did them now, like when introducing them made it more obvious of like opening chapters with Ellie, the granddaughter, Johnny, the private coach, Anna, the maid, Gavin, the butler, when they're first introduced, so that people could keep those straight. Doc, the doctor. But I think the characters that are the most memorable in that are Johnny and Alex, and that is because their personalities are so big. And I was just thinking about them the other day. So at the end of the day, what's that mean for characters or story? My preference, what I love to do, what I love to find in stories is strong, sincere characters who, they don't have to be good people, but they are sincere in their approach. They are sincere in their delivery. They are sincere in what they are trying to get, how they are trying to get it, and they aren't trying to lie to the reader. They're just living their life, and you are there to live with them. And I think a lot of stories don't actually do that, but a lot of people don't necessarily value character above other things. They could Other people may value the world building more, or the plot more, or if it draws in their emotions more, because that is a measurement of enjoyment, is how does this make the reader feel? And if the reader enjoys the feeling of euphoria, of fun, of crying more, they're going to go for that. It's one of the reasons that I will never read A Little Life. I don't care if anybody recommends it to me. I will tell you right now, I will never read it. One, because the cover pisses me off specifically, since it is forcing me to look at a man having an orgasm every time I look at it, because that is what the picture is. I didn't ask for that. Two, I don't like tragedies for tragedy's sake. I don't find value in it. I don't find value in nihilism. I don't find value in stuff just being negative for the sake of being negative. And even in my stories, like the Bodymore series where bad things happen, they don't happen to show that everything is terrible. There is hope in every single one of my stories, specifically. And so I will never read A Little Life, because I don't find value in just tragedy. But a lot of people do. And so keep that in mind. So quickly, this is morning of editing time, but I wanted to find a way to conclude. What is it that I am even talking about today? And that is, what makes a character stand out? For me, it's they live on their own. They are their own people. And I'm sure if you've been around the creative circles at all, you've kind of seen, probably tangentially in the periphery, the conversation between this character thinks of their own, like I'm not in control of the character, and the other people saying you're insane if you think of characters in that way. The truth of the matter is that there are three different ways in which characters are approached, and they're all very different, at least that I have noticed. Number one is the people that see them as tools, like it is a character that fills a role, it plays a stereotype, it plays a position to make the story go along, and usually they have to do certain things in order to push the story. They literally just exist to be tools, and they may be tools for the story, or they might be tools for the audience or for the creator. And I've run into these people when talking about storytelling, and they have a very difficult time understanding that a purpose of a character may be beyond being a tool, as they only see the object of a character and not a character that lives on their own. And I have come to realize that if somebody, like, you can do that and also understand that there are different types of characters. But if somebody is refusing to see that a character can be more than a tool, then that conversation is pretty much at an end for me, because I can't be understood by somebody that just sees a character as a tool. But that's all they are. They're flat. I can usually tell when a character reads like a tool. I can show you what it looks like when it's a tool, but I'm going to always do that within the context of a story, because it's a lot easier to show something when you got an example of it. I would say the characters in the Butt Cracker obviously look like tools because they are just there to accomplish something. And they are specifically tools for the jacking off of the reader because of the genre that is the Butt Cracker. Another way that characters can be approached is as extensions or explorations of the author's psyche. And this is stuff like The Shards by Bret Easton Ellis, or The Small Backs of Children by Lydia Yakanovic, or Detransition Baby by Tori Peters. These are not assumptions made by me. These are the authors having said that these characters are them, and in the context of The Shards, the main character in The Shards is even named Bret Easton Ellis. So you can have stories that are extensions of the author's psyche, of the author's different parts, like compartmentalized parts of their character, of even just who they are, and then exploring things, exploring experiences, exploring emotions, either through one character that then goes and addresses things, or through compartmentalized separate characters, separate parts of the personality, kind of like the idea of Inside Out, where you have those different parts talk to one another. So that is another way to approach characters, where you might consider that still something of a tool, but it is still a more personal approach than strictly as tools, strictly as jack-off material, strictly as hero material. Finally, the third way that I see that you can approach characters, and this is the one that makes them most distinct, not that the explanation, the extension of character, of self as character, does not make them distinct, because that is still a personal identity, much more than a tool. But the third way that I know of that characters can be approached is as themselves, just sincerely as themselves. They are just doing their own thing. You don't really have control over them. You're just following whatever it is they do. And some people have this experience. Some people really don't have this experience, but I think it is something that you learn how to do. You learn how to connect if that's the way that you want to tell stories. I don't think that it is necessarily going to be the most commercial. I think that it is a much more literary way to approach characters. And that's not to say it's better or worse than anything else. It depends on what your purpose is. However, when a character, or when you write characters as themselves, as explorations of themselves, you really don't have control over where stuff goes, because you have to feel it out in the correct way, or else you're breaking the character. And often that's also how I read books, is I'm looking at characters not as tools, but as characters who make decisions for themselves. Why are they doing this? Rational or irrational reasons, the logic behind their choices. And that's what often breaks stories for me and shows me when a character is a tool or not a tool, because a character will always work in what they think is their best interest or in the interest of their objective. And it is only when they are being controlled by somebody else to go in a specific direction that that does not happen. If you want memorable characters, for me, it comes down to the sincerity and the strength of who they are as individuals, and sometimes specifically how loud their characterization is. If you do a fill-in-the-blank character that is meant to allow the reader to insert, personally, I think the character is going to be less memorable. They're going to be easier to replace. But that doesn't mean that your book is not going to be successful or your story is not going to be successful, because there is another way in which your story can be remembered. Remembering characters either comes through emotional response, or something that you had in common with that character that makes it land on a reader. And with that, it's always going to be individual. So all stories, this is one of the ways in which stories will always be subjective, because you can never account on what is going to click with who, or how people are going to read things, or what people are going to have in common with your characters as you make them. And in many cases, with the characters as tools, especially, despite them being a blank slate, people will remember those stories fondly, specifically by the emotional experience they had when reading the book. And that is, I think, what comes in behind when people go, I remember reading this story when I was a teenager and I loved it, and then when I read it again as an adult, I was like, what the heck is this? Because you connected with that story emotionally. But how much did you connect with the character? How much is the character memorable? So I just wanted to add that kind of little bit extra here. Sorry about the little extra rant at the end, but I felt like it was important to express these 3 types of character types that I'm aware of. If you can think of any more, feel free to share them in the comments down below, but it is a way to approach, and none of them are wrong. They are just storytelling tools for telling different types of stories. And it comes back to, what type of story do you want to tell, and who is your audience? What type of audience do you want? And then ending on this, because it's just been kind of a chill, rambly video about like characters and memorable, and what makes something memorable to me. Let me ask you, what makes something memorable to you? Is it story? Is it character? Is it theme? Are there different mixtures of things that stand out to you? What are some of the most memorable stories for you? And in a positive or a negative way, what are some stories that you just cannot forget? And what stories do you recommend people for because of how you just can't forget about them? Let me know in the comments down below. With that said, have a great weekend. I hope this was just a nice chill video to not be anything serious. I know that it's a little bit all over the place, but how else are you going to talk about like 50 different characters, right? With that said, have a great weekend and don't die.
Was that Wayland Cross in the trunk? Do you know, or is that something that's still being figured out?
The person in the trunk was not Wayland Cross.
Is he in trouble?
We don't know who did it, but as the owner of the car, the longer he's missing, the worse it looks for him.
Cross isn't a killer.
For the last couple of years, the average number of murders in Baltimore has been over 300, and it's been going up. Mind you, that's only whatever the badges count as official murder, and believe me, there are people that don't count when they die.
Wayland? If you're down here, tell me. I'm not talking to the badges, I've been looking for you. They found a body in your trunk. Why? Did you do that?
To the left, plain black letters read along the wall, "You walked in the corridor." Once that ends, "You chose the dark" is on the right. My vision goes blurry, flickers black and black and black for longer intervals until I can't see anything at all. I'm not screaming anymore, but my voice echoes back to me. "Where the hell am I?" "You're dead, Josephine." Even smart people do stupid shit sometimes, right?